Hi everyone, welcome back to another video. So today's video is going to be all about how to plan your character builds and so that you maximize your time and resources and that you don't spend time wasting your resin on things that you probably didn't need to in the first place, or so that you don't end up spending any additional resin on characters that you never ended up getting. So if you do find something from this guide helpful, let me know, but if you're looking for something in particular, check the timestamps in the description below. I highly suggest watching the video all throughout so that you get to know all the great tips that I use to maximize my resources and so that I can build good characters. Anyways, let's get started. So the first thing I really want to start out with are materials that you can farm from enemies. Specifically, the ones you'll find here in the enemies guide, and you scroll down and these are the mob drops that you can use for talents and for ascension. Now these things you do want to pre-farm them in advance because there is a daily reset and you can only really look for so many unless you use the interactive map, but sometimes pulling up the interactive map is not always the best solution, especially if you're kind of in a hurry and you only want to do the bounties found here. My answer for that, if you also don't want to go into other people's worlds and collect them, is pre-farm them a few days in advance so that you can get all the daily resets and get as many as you need. Especially when a new region like Natlan just came out and you don't all have access to these, you might want to try and farm them as often as possible. Especially if you're pulling for a character later on that you don't yet have, you don't want to be farming them on the day of their release or spending more time building them than you need to. It's really important to just farm these ahead of time, especially if it's a character that you already know what the materials are, such as the upcoming banner characters. It's always good to farm these materials in advance because you will save time later on and you don't have to wait to ascend your characters. I did this with characters like Farina and Navia, and it really did help because I was able to raise them right away instead of waiting a few days and going into people's worlds to collect materials. As for the next tip, it is to raise the desired weapon that you're going to use on that character. Now please take this advice with a grain of salt because sometimes the weapon that you want to use is not always available and you don't have it handy with you. For example, if it's a weapon that comes from the banner that you haven't pulled on yet, that might be a little bit harder to farm, especially if you're not guaranteed. But the key rule is never spend resin on something that you are not guaranteed. So don't spend resin buying ascension materials for weapons that you don't yet have and you're gonna think you get from the gacha. If you're not guaranteed to get that weapon, do not spend any resin on it. Wait until you actually have it because who knows, you might change your mind later on, but you've already spent the resin and you can't really take that time and resin you spent back. For example, what I did was I pre-farmed the Flusandra for Farina a few months in advance. I did all my fishing and collected ascension materials for this way before I got Farina because I knew that this is the weapon I wanted to use on her. Not only that, but this weapon works on many other characters as well. You can use this sword on various other characters and not only Farina, which was what makes it so valuable. However, if it is a weapon that only really works on a specific character, you might want to wait until you get that character first. If you're still confused by what I mean, let's take another example here. If I'm waiting to pull on Raiden's banner, I would want to pre-farm the catch because I know it's a good weapon for her. But also, if I don't end up getting Raiden, I can use this weapon on other characters like Xiangling because they're also good for her. So either way, it's still a benefit to your account because you're getting a weapon that can be used on multiple characters and you're not wasting your resources since you can use it for your desired character and for other characters as well. But if you know that it's not a weapon that you will really use, such as this defense scaling polearm, which not a lot of characters are defense scaling polearm characters, you don't want to pre-farm materials for this weapon because you know that not a lot of other characters can use it and you're going to want to wait until you have the character that can use this desired weapon. Again, do not spend resin on weapon ascension resources if A, you don't have the weapon, or B, if that weapon can only be used on the character that you do not yet have. So for the next tip, I want you to look in your artifact inventory. Yes, click B, check your backpack, and click over to your artifacts and see what you have here. Because before you go on a huge rampage and use all your fragile resin, condensed resin, transient resin to search for that one perfect piece, I want you to take a look in your artifact inventory because you might just have that piece waiting for you already. Now I know for some people you don't all have a bunch of artifacts because you either thrown them away or put them into other artifacts to get better rolls, but there is a chance that you might just have artifacts that could be raised and could roll into good stats. Now what I like to do when I farm for something, I always lock potentially good artifacts. These are artifacts with stats that can potentially be raised, but I haven't really raised them yet. For example, this feather right here has crit damage and there's a potential of rolling another stat, but I just haven't done it yet. The reason why this could benefit you is you could save a lot of time in artifact domains. Even if it is a new artifact set that your character requires, you still have a good chance of finding an off piece, specifically a goblet perhaps, from another set that might have good stats. All of these artifacts here that I have locked have potentially good stats and can be used for something. Now, not all of them are perfect artifacts, and of course there is still the gotcha when you roll them, but there is a chance of them still rolling into something good, and it could save you a lot of resin if you already know that you have that artifact piece. Now, what I like to do is I like to have a placeholder character where I go into my character menu and I scroll down to the very end to all these characters that are not raised, they don't have any artifacts on them as you can see here, and I put my artifact set of the desired character onto here. If you don't exactly know what I mean, let me give you an example. So if I was farming for a character like Nahida perhaps, I would use a character that has empty artifact slots and I would put Nahida's artifacts on here. So I would look through my artifact inventory and look for everything I need, like let's say I want something with crit rate, I would look to find what I need here, and then let's say I want the sands for example. I'd equip it onto Kirara so she can hold on to my artifacts for now, and you can raise them while you're here. So when the time finally does come when I get Nahida, I don't have to search throughout that big artifact inventory looking for that one piece that I saved, and I just have to take the artifacts from Kirara and I already know where they are. This makes looking in your artifact inventory a lot easier, and it's good for artifact sorting too. You can also check a bunch of stat details and set bonuses, but just keep in mind that some characters do have passives and they might affect those stats, but I still think it's a great way for you to organize your artifacts. If there's anything you take away from this, it's don't spend additional resin on artifacts you need to farm, and just look through what you have already. If you already know that you don't have any artifacts that are worth doing, or your artifact inventory is practically empty, or you might be a new player, still don't farm artifacts until you have that character for sure, because you don't want to be spending resin on something that is not yet set in stone. And another thing, don't farm artifacts until you are at the max artifact domain level, because spending resin on getting 5-star artifacts is way better than getting the lower tier 4-star artifacts. I've made a lot of other videos in the past, so check out my channel and you might find the video that you are specifically looking for. I made a character raising guide, but this is an updated one with all the new tips and stuff. Okay, moving on to the next tip, I want you to now look into your backpack again and look at your talent materials. Now, I know a lot of information is posted about characters. You can find build guides anywhere or materials and resource guides, but there is one thing to pre-farming these materials. Only pre-farm these materials when you know another character is going to use them. For example, my Navia here uses the same talent books as Neuvillette, which means if I didn't yet have Navia and I wanted to pre-farm her resources, I could still be farming those books because I know Neuvillette will use them at some point. That doesn't also mean excessively pre-farm and spend all your condensed and fragile resin on these domains. It just means that only pre-farm something if you know other characters are going to use it, or if you already have the character. The reason this helps is that it manages your time and resources better because these domains are only open on certain days, which means you want to farm as much as possible. I've also made other guides on how to manage your farming time and resources. The key guides you want to check out are my weekly farming routine and my daily farming routine, because it shows you how I manage my time and resources so that I can farm the most out of these talent books while also raising other materials for my characters, such as their ascension materials. The thing about talent books though is that you can actually get them from chests and exploration. So one thing I did was explored a lot of Fontaine before I actually started going into talent domains, because I knew that some Fontaine chests hold these talent books inside. And that cut off a lot of time I spent in the domain farming because I already had access to these books. Now I know it's not a lot and it doesn't always guarantee the kind of book you need, but it does help to some extent, because eventually you probably will need these books. Okay, on to my next tip. Right here, trounce domains. Now these weekly bosses are a little strange because you can only farm them once a week and it doesn't guarantee what materials you're gonna get unless you use a dream solvent. But also, you don't get dream solvents all the time, so it's even harder to farm. So for these, the moment you know what your character needs, pre-farm these. I am so serious about this. The moment you know which character you want to get and know what their materials are, start farming their weekly domain. Like I started farming a pep really early on for Neuvillette, trying to get the most resources as possible, and yet it still took a lot of time. If you're wondering, no, I do not complete all the weekly domains because I think spending a lot of resin on them is not always worth my time. I only do 3 of them, and those 3 are the characters that I want to build and need resources for. However, if you know a new character is coming but you don't know what their talent domain is, or if their talent domain is not out because it's coming in a later patch, this might be a little bit more difficult to farm, and it just really is based on luck. If you're wondering if I use dream solvents, the answer is very rarely, because I pre-farm so early on that I don't end up needing these dream solvents, and I'm not a fan of speeding up the farming process because I like to play the game really long term, and I'm not interested in beating it as soon as possible. Like, I don't max out my character the day I get it because I want to spend a lot of time building them so I can also get to use them and learn how they work. I only use dream solvents if I'm very desperate for resource and I know that I haven't been getting it in the past few weeks. Dream solvents, you want to save these for when the time comes. Honestly, I think my 84 is a little bit excessive because when will you ever really need 84 dream solvents to convert? I probably don't even have that many talent materials, but still, having them on handy is good. And just remember, there is no rush to playing the game. You don't need to speedrun Genshin because sometimes speedrunning it will just cause burnout, which definitely did happen to me. If you are still waiting on that final material, just wait it out. Sometimes it might just come next week and it might just be there. You don't have to spend your dream solvents on it. But I think of all things to spend your resin on, weekly bosses might just be the one that you can spend. However, limit yourself on who you're raising at the moment because you don't want to raise too many characters all at once, since you don't want to be spending any excess resin. I really avoid having to farm more than 3 weekly bosses because I know how much resin it costs and it's not always the best use of it. So just keep that in mind when you're pre-farming. Now onto world mats and world materials that you collect out in the wild. This is the one thing I highly suggest you do pre-farm. If you know you already have access to it and you know what they need, just farm it. It makes your life easier. You don't want to have to be running around, especially if it's a very difficult resource to farm like the starfish or onikabutos or violet grass, just anything that's really lengthy and it's not really farmed in clusters. You want to pre-farm those early because you can wait for their refresh every 2 days and you don't have to be going into other people's worlds last minute the moment you get the character. There are a lot of resources online to find out what characters need what so that you're able to have all the resources you need right as soon as they release. These materials are relatively easy to get, some of them, and they don't use up any of your resin. Also, if you don't end up getting the character that you were hoping for, and you have all these resources, they could probably still be used for a character later on, or if your character gets a rerun. The only thing you really lose is the time you spent farming them, but other than that, it's relatively easy to collect, and it's going to benefit your account overall. Now Hero's Wit. So you've got all the talent materials, you've got ascension materials, but oh no, you don't have any books. Well, some of you might be asking how I have so many, and that is actually through exploration. I love exploring a place and I love going through chests before I usually raise any characters because I know that you can really take up a lot of stuff from these chests. Hero's Wit especially. But I also get some of my Hero's Wit from the teapot and from any other quests that do give it, and any opportunity you have to get Hero's Wit, I highly recommend you take up on that. If you're wondering if you should pre-farm Hero's Wit before you get a character, here's my take on it. If you know that you don't have enough Hero's Wit to raise your character, then you can pre-farm it, because Hero's Wit is a universal thing you can use on every character. But just note that spending your resin on Hero's Wit might not be the best option because there are other ways to get it. If you haven't exhausted all your options, like if you still have exploration to go, if you haven't done your quests, your hangouts, all of that, and there is still Hero's Wit laying around in your world, then absolutely go farm that first before you spend resin in Hero's Wit ley lines. Remember that there are ways to get things without using resin, and I have made videos on how to get resources without having to pour in a bunch of resin, so please check out all those other options before you spend your time in resin on Hero's Wit or any XP. Lastly, we have Mora. So as for Mora, again, most of it comes from exploring and just doing weekly things like bounties or the battle pass or all those other things that you can just do naturally. I haven't had to do a Mora ley line in forever, and I think it's doing pretty good because I don't really raise a lot of characters as well. But if you haven't done events yet, if you haven't done all these things, do those first before you go out and do ley lines. Make ley lines your absolute last resort. If there is nothing in your inventory, then you can go farm more ley lines, but you still want to try out these other options. If you haven't yet, check out in your backpack if you have all these sigils, because a lot of these you can just turn into the sigil store and get Mora for free. Yes, I know, free Mora. If you have any of these bags of Mora, if you have anything that you can cash out at the bank, check those out first, because I am sure you have access to Mora in your backpack and you're just not seeing it before you actually go and spend your resin. My main key to getting mora is exploring and doing lots of quests. Yes, I know it's time consuming and it's not always the fastest option, but it does help in the long run because I end up using that resin for things that are more important, such as artifact farming or farming boss materials. An additional tip I have about farming boss materials: don't farm these materials unless you have someone else that can use them, or don't farm them if you're not guaranteed the character. If you think you might get a character but you are not guaranteed, you're at the 50-50, you don't have a lot of primogems, and you know you're not going to try and pull for them, don't pre-farm them, because at the time it does end up being a waste of resources when you know you could be farming for other things. And if you're not guaranteed and you end up having 40 of some random object in your inventory, it's pretty wasteful, especially if no one else can use it. So that's my advice for farming boss mats. Now, I've made many other guides on primogems and primogem farming, but the majority of where my primogems comes from is actually just exploration. Yes, I do scour the map. If you've checked, I have 100% exploration almost everywhere. All of Fontaine, Chenyu Vale, Mondstadt, Liyue, Inazuma, the Chasm, everything except for Natlan and Samara Desert. I've done Enkanomiya, I've done Sea of Bygone Eras. I've done all these places and scoured every last primogem. And I have made videos about how to get primogems, so I highly recommend checking these out. But primogems are the one thing you do want to farm for. But yes, it is possible to farm a lot of primogems if you are free to play. Along with all of these other tips, they're all for free-to-play players. I've been doing this for years and playing Genshin, and they have been all working for me wonderfully. I've been able to raise the characters I need to. Ultimately, just remember that you're in no hurry to complete something, but again, everyone plays in their own playstyle, so take my advice with a grain of salt. Anyways, that's all the tips I have for today. If you enjoyed this video, let me know. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments. I would be happy to answer any questions or clarify something for you. But other than that, those are my tips, and I hope you found this video helpful, and I will see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day, good luck on your pulls and your Genshin journey moving forward. I hope you get all the weekly boss drops that you want and your dream solvents. Anyways, have a wonderful day. I will see you all in another video. Bye!